The first speaker is Professor Richard Cohen, and I present them according to their wish. Professor Richard Cohen, Professor Emeritus of Jewish History at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, presently Academic Director of Daat HaMakom and Israel Center for Excellence on the Study of Place in Modern Jewish Society. That's what he wrote about himself. One of the leading historians of French Jewry, among many other things. Please, Richie.
Erev Tov. I really feel very strange speaking in Van Leer in English, but I will. Even though it is my mother tongue, I still feel that this is strange for me. Ethan has provided you with the contours of his extremely important and timely book that has cultural significance to the world we live in here in Israel and in the Middle East. In this sense, this is both a historical study that is driven with a desire to uncover the many layers of this entangled brotherhood that all of us who have or had brothers, sisters, and I was wondering if anybody has said that maybe, why did you call this the burdens of brotherhood and not also of sisterhood? That those of us who have or had brothers, sisters, know that even brothers, sisters of the same parents go through many diverse feelings and emotions in their lifetime and changing patterns of relations. And as the author of a book entitled The Burden of Conscience, I would add immediately that this book on brotherhood was also written with a deep sense of commitment and conscience to the unfolding nature of the Jewish-Muslim imbroglio in our age and our country. Our burden. Moreover, at the heart of this most nuanced and rich book, and I dare say at the heart of Ethan Katz, is the unending goal to go beyond the points of conflict and troubling fissures in this brotherhood and reveal sentiments and acts of coexistence in daily life in all of its manifestations, exemplified for him in the creation of the Muslim-Jewish Friendship of France in 2004 and its activities. Eitan's book travels through the 20th century and the many vicissitudes that challenge the brotherhood, the elites and the common people, in times of war, interwar and post-war, with constant references to the enduring burden and memory of the 19th century, especially the Crémieux Law of 1870, that granted the Jews of Algeria full French citizenship, but not the overriding majority of Algerian society, the Muslims. Allow me, therefore, to begin my remarks by first taking a look at something which is not discussed in the book, because I feel that the burden is very much in this pre-20th century issue, and that is, how is it that this tripart relationship, France, Muslims, and Jews, became such an issue of cultural conflict, which to my mind is a subsidiary of a much larger one that has received a great deal of attention in the last years, the apparent clash between the West and the East. How could then Adolphe Crémieux believe that this law, which he was very much behind in 1870, would bring Jews into the French orbit, not create the antagonism of Muslims, and feed on historical images of Jews and power? The French conquest of Algeria that began in 1830 unleashed a profound sense of the hierarchy of civilizations in which Europe stood at the highest rung and Asian and Arab civilizations at the bottom. This ranking existed prior to the invasion, but assumed a more aggressive and self-righteous stand as the French encountered difficulties for almost 17 years to overcome the Algerian opposition. In the interval, they wreaked havoc in the country and resorted to extreme measures. Military figures and French political thinkers of different political persuasions were convinced that France had the right to use extreme force to achieve that goal. A lieutenant colonel in the French colonial enterprise remarked in 1843. All populations that do not accept our conditions must be despoiled. Everything must be seized, devastated, without age or sex distinction. Grass must not grow anymore where the French army has put the foot. Who wants the end, wants the means. In one word, annihilate all that will not crawl beneath our feet like dogs. Orientalism and colonialism met here in a most harsh and fierce manner. This overriding sense of superiority and righteousness pervaded French society from the beginning of its colonial enterprise, and it is at the center in many ways of Ethan Katz's book. The sense in which France saw itself as the highest representation of civilization and had the right to spread it wherever the French treaded. And this, of course, contributed to the collective sense of self that evolved among French Jews in the 19th century as well. A seminal document, Rapport sur l'état moral et politique des Israélites de l'Algérie et des moyens de l'améliorer, was submitted to the Central Committee, the Consistory, in November of 1842. Though the word régénération does not appear neither in the title nor in the text, the conception of regeneration, régénération, hovers over the entire text, whose title and content resemble closely Abbé Grégoire's essay from the eve of the French Revolution. This text provides a profound insight into the thinking, I think, of French Jews on their co-religionists in the East. And I'm wondering sometimes how, in Eaton's presentation, this is in the back of his mind when he is thinking of the conflicts which arise between Muslims and Jews. And it is, to my mind, a text which gives us a sense of the conception of the colonization project, on the image of the Arabs, on the sense of their mission, and how this was to be achieved, and how the Jews envisaged the future relationship between the Jews in France, imagined the relationship between the Algerian Jews and the local and French authorities. To a certain extent, this report reflects attitudes that remain by and large predominant for several decades among French Jews, and I think permeates the principles and spirit of much of what transpires in different areas. And there's a very interesting discussion in Eaton's book on Crémieux as opposed to Joseph Reinach, which I will come back to later on. The authors of this memorandum depicted their Algerian co-religionists. Now here are the French Jews looking at the Algerian Jews as having recently emerged into freedom following 18 centuries of slavery under barbaric treatment. The long and impressive period, they admitted, has left the Jews with many vices that are eons away from the levels of French civilization. These related areas of all areas of life. The Algerian Jews continue to live like a nation within a nation. And for those of you who know the discussions on the French Revolution, and Pierre Birnbaum has just put out a massive new book on the discussion in Metz in 1787, where you can see all these issues. The Algerian Jews continue to live like a nation within a nation, with their own laws that are contrary to progress, whose principles do not coincide with our civilization. And they continue, of course, to dress in shameful clothes, a dishonorable remnant of a period of slavery, reflecting their coat of serfdom, a dishonor originally imposed on them by the Muslims. Now, the Jews continue to be seen by the Jews in France as people who are basically have to go through a period of regeneration. And therefore, the authors concluded that the Jews in Algeria constituted a weak, unfortunate, degenerate nation that French Jewry must take under its wings in this colonialist notion, not only for the sake of human morality, but also for public security. They estimate that there is no possibility for Algerian Jewry to be able to emerge from this state of decay, which I think is very central to the way French Jews are looking at many of their Muslim brethren in the 20th century. That it'll take Algerian Jews a great deal of it'll take them let me read this again, that there is no possibility for Algerian Jewry to be able to emerge from the state of decay and mismanagement without the involvement of an external force, a civilizing one, that is the West. So in this memorandum which Altares and Cohen, the authors of the memorandum, write, there is something optimistic. And there is also something very optimistic about this book which we are discussing today. They believed in the 19th century that these Eastern Jews could rise from the abject condition, but only if, because they are submissive, that they will have to be taken over by people of good heart and intentions, that their medieval tradition will actually, in some way, be turned into something positive, because they live in a country in which the law will become an opportunity for them to improve themselves. Algerian Jews then would, in some way, gradually appreciate French civilization. And they will gradually prefer French furniture by arranging their homes with tables and chairs rather than sitting on the ground. So you see these issues, which of course are going to be then shown when we talk about them in relationship to the Muslims. Altares and Cohen were convinced that once calm sets in and the French clearly show their protection, the Jews would express support for the French flag. They will become patriots, something which of course is very central to Ethan's discussion, and they would contribute to the success of the French armies and to the consolidation of French authority. They believed, as did other Jewish figures and organizations in the 19th century and in the 20th century, that their co-religionists could become an avant-garde, an outpost for French colonization, and a bridge between the former rulers and the new French regime. How did they believe that the Algerian Jews would become a bridge? Now, this is very important for our study, because herein lies the ways in which the East took on such a negative image in the colonialist imagination of the French, and the French Jews, to my mind, no less. Notwithstanding their deficiencies, the Algerian Jews were regarded more positively, superior, of course, to the Arabs, the Moors, and others. The Arabs were clearly, in a sense, of a different civilization. Their archaic structures, lack of order, opposition to change, submission to fate, savage and rude ways of life, ignorance, prejudice, and primitive behavior, it would take them centuries before they could accommodate to French social organization and civilization. Then, by separating the Jews from their Arab past and bringing them close to the French traditions was clearly a part of the agenda of the European Jews. In other words, here you have the French colonialists, and I'm saying that the Jews became very clearly French colonialists in their way of thinking about the Algerian Jews, that they would gradually be able to move out of their Arab roots, and they would maybe become the bridge for the Arabs. The Jews of Algeria were to become in this design a source of influence over other native groups. And in that sense, Jews in France, Altares and Cohen, sensed that they were clearly presenting something which would definitely create an alliance between Jews and France, something which is very important to this book. Jews feel that they are allied to France. To what extent are they also allied to the Muslims? And this is where we will come back to in a moment, in the way Ethan very sensitively treats these different changes in the relationship between Jews and the state and Jews and the Muslims. But this could only be avoided in the goal to strengthen the forces of light. It is, to my mind, this thinking which is at the root of the Crimea Law of 1870 that granted Algerian Jews French citizenship en bloc, subject to French law, and abolished all second-class regulations which the Algerian Jews entertained as dhimmis before that. The Crimea Law then overturns the history of the relations between Jews and Muslims in Algeria. It created a clear reversal of the existing situation by turning the former unprivileged into privileged, free of Islamic law. in every sense into a superior status to the Muslims, something which will be transformed, as Eaton points out, in the Second World War. To my mind, we have here a joint colonialist effort that emerged from deep Orientalist discourse shared by French Jews and French rulers who believed in the noble and grand humane mission of improving and moralizing a population that lived in servitude for 18 centuries, but saw in dehumanized ways the Algerian Muslims who fought France tenaciously. So in a sense, you can understand that one has to, in the 20th century, go through a major reversal to create a true sense of brotherhood. When the Muslims feel that the Kremlin law was always a kind of cabal which the Jews and France imposed upon Algeria, and therefore one had to overcome this in order to create a sense of brotherhood. Let me just remind you of what Alexis de Tocqueville writes on the Algerians in 1841. Not very pleasant for those who remember de Tocqueville for other great works of his. In 1841 he writes, "In France I have often heard men I respect, but do not approve of, deplore that crops should be burnt and granaries emptied, and finally that unarmed men, women, and children should be seized. In my view, these are unfortunate circumstances that any people wishing to wage war against the Arabs must accept. I personally believe that the laws of war enable us to ravage the country, and that we must do so either by destroying the crops at harvest time or any time, by making fast forays, also known as raids, the aim of which is to get hold of men or flocks." Altaraz and Cohen enunciated this somewhat differently. These obscure insects will be looking in vain for the light. We must help bring them the light. They shared the common belief that one must go ahead with one's goal, notwithstanding opposition. That's the shadow that Eaton's book seeks to unpack by revealing the depths of the impact of French colonialism, what he calls the Jewish cabal in the form of the Kremlin law in the minds of Muslims, and the orientation of French North African Jews who try to reorient themselves between their desire to become French and their lingering feelings of belonging to the North African cultural milieu. The seesaw that Eaton describes is fascinating. How in different periods of the 20th century, Jews and Muslims could be at one point side by side, as he tries to show in chapter 1 that he mentioned, at another period that they are loggerheads, and then the tables will turn, especially in World War II, when the Kremlin law is abrogated under Vichy, and Jews will lose their preferred status and beneath the Muslims in France and in North Africa. Eaton looks in nooks and crannies to uncover points of contact, areas of intermingling, conflict, misunderstandings, joint activity, and resistance, and finds voices of understanding and cooperation. Joseph Reinach and Bernard Lecache, Mahidin Bachetalzi and Dr. Mohammed Ben-Jalloul. Moments of great tension, like the riots in 1934 in Constantine, or the Zionist rally in October 29, 1944. But always, in Eitan's presentation, we are treated to much more than a simple recording of the events, as intricacy is the hallmark of the way he works and in his orientation. An example in kind is his very astute treatment of Si Kadour Ben Grabit, an important Muslim figure, the rector of the Grand Mosque of Paris and of the Institut Musulman, who during World War II apparently hid Jews from the Nazis, but also cooperated in one form or another with the Nazis. In a sense, what is so interesting in this book is that Katz always takes these events, sometimes opposing activities, but judiciously sees them in a kind of careful balancing that was in many ways, I think, in his mind, emblematic of Jewish-Muslim relations, not only in the occupation, but later. And so, as we move on in the book, into the second section of the book, in his treatment of several seminal events which impact upon the relations between the brothers, decolonization, the establishment of the State of Israel, the War of 1967, we're constantly seeing the orientations of Jews and Muslims to France and to one another. And in those discussions, one is opened a true melange of ideas, experiences, interrelationships, political, cultural, and social. In a sense, we have here a wonderful example in the way he treats the way Jews dealt with decolonization, their rejection of Albert Memmi's more singular response, preferring, I would think, to give expression to the different parts of their being, if you will, a kind of hybridity. By writing history from below and bringing to bear archives from a host of sources, Katz reveals himself to be constantly aware that social and cultural relations can exist simultaneously on different levels among diverse elements of the population. We can see at the same time that music, cafes, food, sports, and other forms of interaction could persevere throughout the 20th century, even as major differences of opinion among different elements of the Jews and the Muslims continue to exist. As, for instance, if you look at this wonderful chapter which deals with Algeria, 1954-1960, and how the different groups are responding. While they're responding to the major events, there is also something else happening on a different level. People going to hear Arabic music, going to cafes where Jews and Arabs are living, Muslims are living, and so on. And so, in this very attentive way in which Muslims and Jews inhabited Paris, Marseille, or Strasbourg, and Katz's very sensitive sense of the changing demographic scene in these cities, we can see the implications of what it means to live together in such surroundings. And of course, for us living in Jerusalem, this is something which we should have an opportunity to think about in this context. But Katz avoids taking events at face value. Yes, there could be moments of conflict in a cafe, during a card game between a Jew and a Muslim, in a joint rally, in a game of sports. But even then, the analysis has to go a step or two deeper to truly unravel the sources of the tension and whether it was all consuming. Thus, and I'm concluding, the burdens of brotherhood is an optimistic historical study, not because it avoids conflict, not because it avoids anti-Semitic rallies or statements, or the discussion of Jewish-Muslim riots, those of June 1970, for instance, and those of 1972, but rather because it treats such developments with an appropriate distance and equanimity. But maybe even more important is the historical methodology that Katz has significantly adapted in this book. I am, of course, referring to something he himself noted in his brief remarks to us at the beginning, the need to look at this tripartite relationship in the ways in which external events, visions of state and citizenship impacted on the brothers, and the ways in which the brothers were moved to respond to them and to each other. By taking into consideration the ways in which Muslims and Jews figured in the minds of the state, and the way the state viewed each of them at different times, Katz has pushed us to write history with greater attention to the dimensions of interreligious relationships, much in the way it has been unfolding in the work of scholars such as Todd Shepard, Benjamin Stora, Maud Mandel, and Daniel Schrader. Thus, the historical memory of the Crémieux Law of 1870, the favoring of one religious group over another, the Orientalist presumptions could only be reversed by accepting France as a multi-ethnic republic with the acceptance of ethnic difference. Thank you.